"You have brought clear skies with you," said Centurion Quintus Hilarion, lounging in the window of the commander's quarters and peering into the night. "But, Hercule, you'll need not expect it to last." "As bad as that?" said Centurion Marcus Aquila, who was seated at the table. "Quite as bad as that. It rains always here in the West, save when Typhoon, the father of all ills, brews up a mist to come between a man and his own feet. By the time you have served your year here, you will have toadstools sprouting out of your ears, the same as me, and not from the damp alone." "From what beside?" inquired Marcus with interest. "Oh, lack of company, for one thing. I am a sociable soul myself. I like my friends around me." He turned from the window and folded up on a low cushioned bench, hugging his knees. "Ah, well, I am off to rub away the blue mold as soon as I have marched the troops back to Isca." "Going on leave?" The other nodded. "Long leave, lovely leave, among the flesh pots of Durinum." "Durinum? That is your home?" asked Marcus. "Yes. My father retired and settled there a few years ago. There is a surprisingly good circus and plenty of people, pretty girls too. A pleasant enough place to get back to, out of the wilds." An idea seemed to strike him. "What shall you do when your leave falls due? I suppose, coming out from home, you have no one here to go to." "I have an uncle at Khaliva, though I have not met him yet," Marcus said, "and certainly there is no one at home I should want to spend my leave with." "Father and mother both dead?" inquired Hilarion with friendly interest. "Yes. My father went with the Ninth Legion." "Pericle? You mean when they—" "Disappeared, yes." "So that is bad," said Hilarion, wagging his head. "A deal of ugly stories there were, still are for that matter, and of course they did lose the eagle." Instantly Marcus was up in arms to defend his father and his father's legion. Since not a man of the legion came back, it is scarcely a matter for wonder that neither did the eagle, he flashed. "Surely not," agreed Hilarion, amicably. "I was not blowing on your father's honor, so you can keep your feathers on, my Marcus." He looked up at the other with a wide, friendly grin, and suddenly Marcus, who had been ready to quarrel with him the instant before, found himself grinning back. It was several hours since Marcus had marched his cohort across the hollow ringing bridge, answering the sentry's challenge. "Fourth Gaulish Auxiliaries of the 2nd Legion, come to relieve this garrison." Dinner was over in the officers' mess with the quartermaster, the surgeon, and a double complement of ranker centurions. Marcus had taken charge of the pay chest keys. In a garrison as small as this there was no paymaster, and for the past hour, here in the commander's quarters in the praetorium, he and Hilarion had been going through the office work of the frontier fort. Now, crested helmets and embossed breastplates laid aside, the two of them were taking their ease. Through the doorless opening, Marcus could see almost the whole of the sleeping cell, the narrow cot piled with gay native rugs and polished oaken chests, and lamp bracket high on the bare wall, and nothing more. The outer room held the battered writing table on which Marcus was sitting, a cross-legged camp stool, the cushioned bench to represent comfort, another chest for the record rolls, and a bronze pedestal lamp of peculiarly hideous design. In the little silence that had fallen between them, Marcus looked round him at the austere room in the yellow flood of lamplight, and to him it seemed beautiful. But though it would be his tomorrow, for this one night he was a guest here, and he looked back to his host with a quick smile of apology for having looked too soon at his surroundings with the eye of mastery. Hilarion grinned. You will not be feeling like that this day next year. I wonder, said Marcus, swinging one sandaled foot and idly watching the swing of it. What does one do here, beside growing toadstools? Is there good hunting? Good enough. It is the one thing here to be said for this particular corner of the empire. Boar and wolf in the winter, and the forest swarms with deer. There are several hunters below in the town who will take you out for the price of the day's work. Unwise to go alone, of course. Marcus nodded. Have you any advice for me? I'm new to this country. The other considered. No, I think not. Then he sat up with a jerk. Yes, I have. If no one has warned you already. But it has nothing to do with the hunting. It is the priest kind, the wandering druids. If one of them appears in the district, or you get the least idea that there is one about, look to your weapons. Good advice, that is. The druids? Marcus was surprised and puzzled. But surely Suetonius Paulinus dealt with them once and for all 60 years ago. As an organized priesthood, maybe, but as easily hold off these heathen myths with a palm leaf umbrella as end the druids by destroying their stronghold. They spring up still from time to time, and wherever they do spring up, there is likely to be trouble for the eagles. They were the heart and soul of British resistance in the early days, and even now. And when there is any sign of unrest among the tribes, you can wager your sandals there is a holy man at the bottom of it. Go on, Marcus prodded, as the others seemed to have finished. This becomes interesting. Well, the thing's this. They can preach holy war, and that is ever the most deadly kind, for it recks nothing of consequences. Hilarion spoke slowly, as though he was thinking the thing out as he went along. The frontier tribes are not like those of the south coast, who were half Romanized before ever we landed. They are a wild lot and superbly brave, but even they have mostly come to think that we are not fiends of darkness, and they have enough sense to see that destroying the local garrison will only mean a punitive expedition, and their homes and standing crops burned, and a stronger garrison with a heavier hand thereafter. But let one of their holy men lay hold of them, and all that goes whistling down the wind. They cease to think whether there can be any good of their rising, cease to think at all. They are keeping faith with their gods by smoking out the nest of the unbelievers, and what happens after is no concern of theirs, for they are going west of the sunset by the warrior's road. And when you get men into that state, there is apt to be trouble coming. Outside, in the quiet darkness, the trumpet sounded for the second watch of the night. Hilarion uncurled himself and stood up. We had best do late rounds together tonight, he said, and reached for his sword, slipping the baldric over his head. I am a native born, he added, as though in explanation. That is how I came to have some understanding of these matters. I imagine that you must be. Marcus tested a buckle of his own equipment. You have had no holy man around here, I suppose? No, but my predecessor had a certain amount of trouble just before I took over, and the troublemaker slipped through his fingers and disappeared. We lived a month or two on Vesuvius, all the more so as the harvest was bad for the second year running, but it never erupted. Footsteps sounded outside, and a red light glimmered out the window, and they went out together to the duty centurion, who stood outside with a flaring torch. The clashing Roman salute was exchanged, and they set out on their tour of the darkened fort, from sentry post to sentry post, along the rampart walk, from guard point to guard point, with the low exchange of the password, lastly to the small lighted room in the praetorium, where the pay chest was kept and the standard stood against the wall, and between rounds and duty centurion sat with his drawn sword on the table before him through the night. Marcus thought, after tonight it will be for me alone to follow the centurion's torch from guard post to guard post, from barrack block to horse lines, seeing that all is well with the frontier of the empire. Next morning, after the former takeover ceremony in the Forum, the old garrison marched out. Marcus watched them go out across the ditch and downhill between the crowding hovels of the native town, whose reed-thatched roofs were gold-dusted by the morning sun. Sentry after sentry, marching away up an long road that led to Isca, and at their head the glint of gold and crimson that was the cohort standard. He narrowed his eyes into the piercing light, and watched that colored glint till it disappeared into the brightness of the morning. The last driver of the baggage train dropped out of sight beyond the lift of the road, and rhythmic tramp, tramp, tramp of heavily sandaled feet ceased to pulse through the sunlit air, and Marcus was alone with his first command. Chapter 2. Feathers in the Wind. Before many days had passed, Marcus had slipped so completely into the life of the frontier fort that it seemed as though he had never known any other. The plan of all Roman forts was much the same, and the pattern of life lived in them, so that knowing one meant knowing them all. Whether it was the stone-built camp of the Praetorian Guard itself, or a baked mud fort on the upper Nile, or this one at Isca Domnoniorium, where the ramparts were of rammed turf, and the cohort standard and the officers were all housed together in one small square of wattle and daub buildings round a colonnaded courtyard. But after a few days, Marcus began to know the individualities that made every camp different, after all, from every other, and it was these differences rather than the samenesses that made him feel at home in Isca. An artist of some long-departed garrison had scratched with his dagger a beautiful leaping wildcat on the bathhouse walls, and someone less gifted had scratched a very rude picture of a centurion he had not liked, and you could tell it was a centurion by the vine staff and the centurion's mark scored beneath it. There was a martin's nest under the eaves of the shrine where the standard was housed, and an odd and untraceable smell behind number 2 storehouse, and in one corner of the officers' courtyard some past commander, homesick for the warmth and color of the South, had planted a rose bush in a great stone wine jar, and already the buds were showing crimson among the dark leaves. That rose bush gave Marcus a sense of continuance. It was a link between him and those who had been before him, here on the frontier, and the others who had come after. It must have been there a long time, and it was becoming pot-bound. He thought that in the autumn he would see about having a proper bed made for it. It took him a little while to settle down with his officers. The surgeon, who appeared like the quartermaster to be a fixture, was a gentle soul, content enough in his backwater so long as it contained sufficient fiery native spirit, but the quartermaster himself was something of a trial, a little red angry man who had missed promotion and grown overfull of his own importance in consequence. Lutorius, who commanded the fort's one squadron of Dacian horse, spent all his friendliness on his horses and was revered to the point of sullenness with all men, even his own. Marcus's 5 ranker centurions were all so much older and more experienced than he was that at first he was uncertain how to deal with them. It was not easy, with less than a year with the Eagles behind him, to tell Centurion Paulus that he was overfond of using his vine staff on his men's backs, or make Centurion Galba understand that, whatever might be the custom in other cohorts, the centurions of the 4th Gaulish were not going to take bribes from their men for letting them off fatigues while he was in command. But he managed it somehow, and the odd thing was, though both Galba and Paulus raged inwardly at the time, and even talked to each other about puppies, there was a better understanding between them and the cohort commander afterwards. And between Marcus and his second in command there was a good working understanding from the first, which grew to a warm liking as time went by. Centurion Drusillus, like most of his kind, was promoted from the ranks. He was a veteran of many campaigns, full of odd wisdom and hard counsel, and Marcus had need of such that summer. Days started with the trumpets sounding cock-crow and the ramparts, and ended with late rounds, and between came all the complicated pattern of parades and fatigue patrols out in stables arms drill. He had to be his own magistrate, too. He had to deal with the situation when one of his men claimed that a tribesman had sold him a worthless dog, or a tribesman complained that someone from the fort had stolen his poultry, or when the Dacians and the Gauls fell out over some obscure question of a tribal god whom he had never heard of before. It was hard work, especially in the earliest days, and he was thankful for Centurion Drusillus, but the work was in his blood, just as farming was, and it was work that he loved, and it was not all work. There was the occasional day's hunting, too, good hunting, even as Hilarion had said. His usual guide and companion on the trail was a Briton not many years older than himself, a hunter and horse dealer, Cradock by name, and on the morning of late summer he went down from the fort carrying his hunting spears to pick up Cradock according to custom. It was very early, the sun not yet up, and the mist lying like a white sea between the hills. Scent would lie low and heavy on such a morning, and he sniffed the dawn chill like a hound. And yet he could not find his usual pleasure in the fine hunting morning, for he was worried. Not very worried, but enough to take the keen edge off the blade of his enjoyment, turning over in his mind the rumor that had been drifting through the fort for the past day or two, the rumor of a wandering druid having been seen in the district. Oh, no one had actually seen him themselves. It was much more vague than that. None of the less, remembering Hilarion's warning, he had checked up as best he could, without, of course, the least result. But even if there were something in the wind, there would be no result, nothing to be got even from the few men who felt official positions from Rome. If their first loyalty was to Rome, they would know nothing. If it was to their tribe, they would tell nothing. Probably there was not a scrap of truth in the story. It was just one of those floating rumors that blew up from time to time, like the wind out of nowhere. But he would keep his eyes and ears open, all the same, especially as once again, for the 3rd year running, the harvest was going to be a poor one. You could tell that from the faces of the men and women as well as you could from their little fields, where the corn stood thin and shriveled in the air. A bad harvest was always the time to look for trouble. As he treaded his way among the crowding huts beyond the forum, it struck Marcus again how untouched this place was by Rome. The tribe found the forum and basilica useful to hold their markets in. One of the two men laid aside their hunting spears to become Roman officials. Occasionally, one even saw a Roman tunic. There were wine shops everywhere. The craftsmen of the town made things to please the garrison, and everybody else sold them dogs, skins, vegetables, and fighting cocks, while the children scrambled after the auxiliaries for denarii. But all the same, here in Isca Dumnoniorum, Rome was a new slip grafted onto an old stock, and the graft had not yet taken.